As you all know, we are pleased today to have Senator Robert Krist with us. Senator Krist currently serves in the Nebraska Unicam, representing the 10th Legislative District, a position he has held for the last 8 years. In that capacity, he has served as the chair of the Executive Board of the Legislative Council and as the chair of the Legislative Referencing Council, among other positions. He has been a member of numerous legislative committees, germane for us, the Senate Judiciary Committee, among many others. Lieutenant Colonel Krist served for 20 years in the United States Air Force, serving in both Operation Desert Storm and Desert Shield. He was also involved in flight operations and management of the Looking Glass, which many of us see in the sky from time to time, though based it off it, that plane does come to Lincoln on occasion because of our long runway. In 2014, Lieutenant Colonel Krist was inducted into the Nebraska Aviation Hall of Fame. And as I believe we're all aware, Senator Krist is currently running for governor in this coming November's election. Senator Krist.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks. So the first thing you always want to do is correct the guy who invited you, right? Just to make the mood very, very happy. It's actually 10 years. I've been there for 10 years, and it's been a decade of what I would consider to be some of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I understand that you've invited me down and that some of you are in the occupation or in the training to be in the judicial system in one way or another. And so I'd like to start off just briefly talking about my experiences over 10 years and where I think we are better than we were 10 years ago and the work that still needs to be done. I see many familiar faces here, and I'm going to center today a little bit on an area that's near and dear to their hearts, and that would be juvenile justice. I'm a firm believer. When I first came to the legislature, I thought I'm going to get on the education committee and change the world. And I think every person who comes in the legislature thinks they know everything about everything and is going to change everything. I also thought I knew everything about everything and found out very quickly that I did not. I think one of the greatest experiences of my life was actually carrying through from my Air Force career when we had intel briefings every morning, but my legislative career was filled with new ideas, new concepts, and new metrics. I'm an evidence-based kind of guy, so I believe that you shouldn't try to reinvent the wheel to get to where you need to get to. And there were people around me, Dr. Hobbs being one, who told me, here is the state of the state. Here is the state of the judiciary. Here's the state of juvenile justice. And here are the things that we need to do to correct juvenile justice. I also had the unique pleasure, and I mean this sincerely, of being mentored by people who had been there for years and years before. One of them being Senator Ernie Chambers. Believe it or not, who knows everything about everything, I'm pretty well convinced. But Senator Chambers, Senator Brad Ashford, Senator Steve Lathrop, the Chief Justice of the state of Nebraska, Mike Hebekin, and a few others in parole and probation that described to me a process that was severely broken. At the time, the mantra within the Department of Health and Human Services was, when in doubt, yank them out. And I'm talking about kids in crisis or kids in a safety situation that we automatically said, if it's bad at home or if it's bad for the child, take them away from the family and create miracles so that you heal them. I found out very quickly that treating one side of the equation or the other doesn't work. If you take a child out of the home, first of all, now you are that parent's child. And let me just comment on where we are today, because I think we have regressed in the last 4 years, which is one of the reasons I'm running for governor. But enough with the campaign speech. I believe that our kids, when they come to us as wards of the state, need to be protected. We've had deaths, we've had sexual abuse, we've had all kinds of allegations that should have never happened in the last few years. We had made progress and took our eye off the ball a little bit, and we've had some issues. But back to the point. When you take a child out of the home, you then become that child's parents. And our foster care program, when I first came into the legislature, was packed with people, absolutely packed with people. In fact, one of the first things I did after being appointed is attended an event in Omaha, Nebraska, where they brought in kids from all the different school districts. And they talked to them about kids' problems that were confronting those kids in day-to-day life. It was sponsored by, actually, my predecessor in the legislature, Senator Mike Friend, who had taken a job creating what was a juvenile justice issue that became the JGI, that became the follow-on to juvenile justice in terms of the metrics that we collect and the action that we take in its infancy, and within criminology, I think was his general job description. But he brought these kids together and he said, what's important to you? What are the things that affect your life on a daily basis? Now you would think that kids from, how many Omaha folks do we have in here? Okay, so you know, you would think, what school district were you in? Papillion La Vista. Ma'am? Omaha South. Anybody from West Side? Okay, and the North Omaha community, OPS? Okay, you would think if you came from your individual school districts that you would have much different answers on the top 5 things that affect my life. Wouldn't you? You'd have socioeconomic, you'd have all kinds of different issues. In the top 2 on every one of those school districts, all of them were represented, remember, was foster care. They either had a friend, they themselves were in the system, they watched kids get into the system, come out of the system. One of the things that affected me very much, listening to her talk, was an 18-year-old who was looking forward to the day when she could age out, she did age out of the system basically while we were in this conference. She had been in 11 different foster homes in a 7-year period, had been sexually abused to the point where she had to terminate an unwanted pregnancy because of someone who had relationships with her in the home. She talked about what happens when you're taken away from your home. She talked about the feelings that were there. And I made it my mission to know that academics, in terms of the education committee, was no longer going to be my focus. It was going to be the mosaic of what happens to our kids. Because as I learned very quickly in those first 2 years, our juvenile justice system in the shallow end is a feeder to the deep end. And the deep end is a feeder to becoming an adult and becoming some kind of criminal, whether it's deep end or shallow end. And then a pipeline to our criminal justice system and our penitentiary, our adult criminal justice system. Stop it in the playpen, treat it in the playpen, and you'll have less problems in the state pen. It's usually cheaper and more effective to be treated early on. We need to pay attention to those kids as they manifest whatever abhorrent behavior they might have at the beginning. If we would have intervened with Nico Jenkins when he was 7 years old, is everyone familiar with Nico Jenkins and the case study that was done and the studies that we did? Okay. If we would have intervened, would the results have been the same? I don't know. I have no idea. I know that behavioral and mentally, Mr. Jenkins is definitely needs therapy, needs treatment, and needs medication. But I don't know what would have happened to that 7-year-old Nico Jenkins if we would have treated him when he first manifested himself bringing a knife or a gun to school, when he was first placed in one of 7 foster homes in a 3 or 4 year period. What would have happened to Mr. Jenkins? I was involved in LR 424, which was a study in Nico Jenkins as it started out, and it became a study in where our corrections system was at that time. As we peeled back this onion, we found that our correction system, our prison system, was broken. It was broken because We had stopped funding the programs inside the penitentiary, inside our prison system, that would create an environment where, remember, 83% of the people who are in prison, depending upon whose numbers you listen to, but better than 80% of the people who are in prison right now will be released, will come back to your communities. So what we do with them when they're in the prison system will tell you whether they're going to recidivate or whether they're going to be in that swinging door getting back in there. So we stopped the treatments. We had an unlimited amount of time when people could be in solitary confinement. Unlimited. We had no restrictions. Now, in my training in the Air Force, we had a brief period of time, and I was in a highly classified area in reconnaissance where we had that training in resistance. I was in a very short period of time and realized what psychologically that isolation did to me and what it could do to me long term. So I took those values and that core that I brought with me into this discussion and realized there have to be some changes in our correction system. That became a mosaic for me to look at. Stop it here, treat it here in the juvenile system, try to intervene before someone gets into the adult system, try to create diversion programs that we have, specialty courts that would treat the individual, try to keep people out of prison before they get there. It's not always possible. There are obviously bad people. There are kids who need to be treated differently. But here's a success story. Having that mentality, and it wasn't me alone, it's not I, there's no I in team. We had several bills, 7 in total, over an 8-year period that changed our juvenile justice system. It's not perfect, folks, but it's a whole lot better than what it was. And it gets better every day because people focus on the issues, focus on what we had put in place to focus on the issues. We have now 50% of the kids that we used to have before this legislation in our detention facilities in YRTC Kearney and YRTC Geneva. Geneva for the females and then Kearney for the males. Half the population. We were averaging over 300 at some points in the Kearney system, Kearney institution. We're now down to an average of less than 100. Now, how do you do that? How do you get that number to come down? You invest. You invest in kids, in education, in diversion systems, in alternatives. I learned early on, again, not to invent the wheel. There was the MacArthur Foundation that did extensive research in juvenile justice. There's Annie E. Casey that did extensive research in juvenile justice. There was an Annie E. Casey invention called JDAI, Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative. And it looked at all the programs out there that we could provide to a child to keep him out, he or she out of the deep end once they got into the shallow end of the system. And it went one step further. Keep them out of the shallow end of the system by trying to evaluate mental behavioral health and substance abuse issues as early as 3 years old. That investment is critical. That investment and the continuity of that investment will continue to yield the results that we're seeing today. If your budget depends upon providing those services to those kinds of programs, then you better keep your eye on the ball and make sure that you continue to fund those programs. What's happened in the last few years is we have taken our eye off the ball and we have stopped funding some of those programs, and we're seeing regression throughout the state. And let's just talk about the state as an example. This state is so diverse. How many people from western Nebraska or have ever been there? Okay, where from?
I've been there.
You've been there, okay. When I first came in the legislature, we had a program a few years prior where they tried to privatize the children and family services across the state. And then the state did not properly fund the programs that were out there. So those mom and pop small businesses, we talk about growing Nebraska and growing businesses. We invested in those programs to provide those services to those kids in a privatization mode, and then we didn't fund it correctly. My first experience in 2009 when I was appointed was traveling to Scottsbluff and watching an 11-year-old come out to meet us from his cell with an orange jumpsuit that was a male size as small as it could get, rolled up in the pants legs, rolled up in the sleeves. He'd been there for 30 days. He was awaiting a psychological evaluation because we didn't have enough psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals to get out there and see him. And the only place to put him was the county jail. That's what did it for me. That's what told me that things don't have to be this way, and why I started on that journey that I just talked to you about. That's why once you fix a problem, you can never stop maintaining those fixes as you go forward. An investment into a program means that you have spent the money on the front end, on the metrics, on the back end are going to tell you where you should be and where you shouldn't be. We had a bill in the legislature last year, LB 998. It's important to me because it was my running partner, Senator Lynn Wall's bill. She introduced it, shepherded it through, and got it passed on the last day of the legislative session. It would have provided mental health and behavioral health evaluations and a social worker in each one of the ESUs around the state. An ESU is the Educational Service Unit that services many of the school districts that they have in their district, in their area. It would have started evaluating kids as early as 3 years old. It was vetoed after we left the session for no apparent reason. But we then had a classic example of what that bill would do and what that further investment would do. We went up to South Sioux City and we watched a program that had blossomed from a pilot project, federal funded pilot project, where they put, it was either 11 or 12 mental health professionals, social workers in the actual school district in South Sioux. They had taken an evidence-based program that was brought to them. They were given the money to run the project for 3 years. When the money ran out, the school district decided that there were such good outcomes that they were going to continue to fund those folks who had been put in place. Why? Because they were evaluating students as young as 3 years old. They were identifying mental and behavioral health problems, and they were treating them in the school system. And in Nebraska, with our small schools and our small communities and the incredible generational poverty that we have throughout Nebraska, our school districts are that place where that child is going to come to school and ask for help or need help. So we believe that that's the right way to go. Now, I've talked about juvenile justice, how it leads to more people in the prison system. I've talked about one bill in particular. I think you can see that it's not just one fix. If you have a problem with a child and you need to fix that problem, what is it? What do they say? It takes a village to raise a kid? It is true. And the capability of the village will tell you how well you're going to treat. And I don't think that justice needs to be by geography or demographics. And I think you need to keep that in mind as you go through your curriculum in terms of justice and criminology. Because if you have pockets of good and pockets of not so good, you need to bring them together. Look at the blueprints. Look at the blueprint of what someone's doing really well and incorporate that in the ideas around. Again, reinventing the wheel. There are always new ideas, don't get me wrong. And there's always science that will tell us that we need to move in a different direction. But 9 times out of 10, there's always a baseline that you can start with to build. And that's what I've seen in 10 years. If I were there for another 10 years, I would continue to advocate for the continuity of funding. I would continue to advocate for that metric that we need in terms of studying the base of what we have done and looking to reinvest our money in different ways maybe, or in the same way. You know, you've all heard probably that a well-educated person knows about 10% of their information and knows where to find the other 90%. I found that out by talking to people like Dr. Hobbs and the JJI, who have been able to give me metrics so I can make a decision. And many times, although Ann's never done it to me, but many times somebody will come in the door and say, "What were you thinking?" Because the numbers don't add up. The statistics are there. We need to move in a different direction. You don't always know everything you need to know. You need to listen and make sure you find that information. I'm going to talk about corrections for another 5 minutes or so, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. Our corrections system in the state is broken severely. We know that we have an overcrowding situation. We're being sued by the ACLU for human rights issues in that overcrowding situation. We know we have a third of our corrections officers that are, we have an attrition of 30% of our corrections officers every year. Now try, no matter where you're from, try to go back and run a business or have your parents run a business or you run your business, losing 1/3 of your employees every year so you have to retrain. That's costing us about $15,000 per person to retrain to put them back on the job. And what we become is an excellent training center for all the states around us and all the counties around us that are paying more. The profession of a corrections officer needs to be a profession where they see a way up within the corrections process. And far too long, in your future career field, if you're all in criminology and corrections and justice, for far too long, our mentality has been throw them in jail, throw away the key, and not taking care of those things that need to be taken care of, the corrections officers, our police officers, our first responders being right on the top of that list. I believe honestly that the corrections system in Nebraska will explode as soon as the ACLU suit takes hold, and the Department of Justice, as it has in other states, come in and show us how to fix our problem. And we're not going to like that. When the Department of Justice comes in and tries to fix your problem, it's beyond your control. They'll spend your money the way they need to, and they will release the people that they think need to be released. Which goes back fundamentally to a corrections issue that we all need to be aware of. There are people that need to be in prison, and there are people who are not. Because of the lack of behavioral and mental health and substance abuse treatment in this state, we have created a correction system that is trying to deal with all of those problems inside those walls. And worse yet, we still have illicit illegal drugs entering the prison system, which is creating another problem inside. There have been more incidents, accidents, riotous activities, deaths, and murders inside the corrections system in the last 4 years than we've seen in the previous 30. The culture has to change, he says. Not my words. There are plenty of good people in that system that are culturally adapt to doing their job, and they're good at doing it. But the way that they're being told to do it right now is creating a lot of problems. You need to be aware of that correction system because it's going to take an additional burden of our dollars for a short period of time. But as everything else, if you put the money up front and change the system, you're going to have savings on the back side. So I think the correction system by itself should get your attention. And if you're really a corrections system science guru, a lot of things that are happening that are currently in place in our current science, criminal justice science, should apply within the system, and they are not being applied today. The Council of State Governments has an interesting read on what should be done with corrections. They came in and helped us try to form a pathway, a blueprint to fix our problem, and we haven't stuck to that blueprint, which I think is unfortunate, and getting back to that blueprint would yield some great results. I also believe, and I have a prepared statement, but I'll wait until after your questions and see if we get to it, about fairness, about justice, about the free press, about the kind of things that are important to you, to this institution, and to the fair treatment of issues that have happened within this institution. but we'll see if we get to those questions. I find that a lot of times you came to hear me speak about an issue, and I may not have hit what you want to talk about. So I'm hoping that this is an interactive, that you will be able to ask questions that I can answer for you. And if I can't, as always, I'll let Ann answer.
The floor is yours.
Excuse me.
Emily Lindblad, thanks for coming out today,
Sure.
Senator. I'm from Southeast Nebraska, and I think what you said about giving correctional officers a way to move up and seek promotions was a really interesting point, because I've had family members, had friends work as correctional officers. It's the same pay if you've worked there 1 year or 10 years. It just doesn't matter. How do you see that change coming about? How would you structure that so that there's more room for them to get promoted and make it a career?
Yeah, I think that starting salary is $18.15 an hour, and that a person who comes in fresh is getting paid the same as an 8 or 10 year. So you're absolutely correct in terms of your assessment. How would I fix it? I think I've helped in the process as a state senator. I've encouraged the corrections officers to defect, if you will, from the state union, because they were put in with an array of people. Most times in a large union base, you're put in with other specialties, and particularly in the federal government or in the state. They weren't treated fairly, I think, in that process. So we've worked for the last few years, and it actually went to the Supreme Court because the state fought them in terms of getting out of the Nebraska State Employees Union. They're now part of the FOP, the Police Officers Union. I think they'll be more capable, and obviously, if I have anything to say about it, more fairly treated in the system itself. And I don't think it's all about dollars and cents. Okay, when you have a 30% attrition rate and you have to keep those posts filled, you have no choice but to either put the entire system in lockdown, which is isolation. It's in your cell 24 hours a day, 23 and a half hours a day, 365 days a year. And it's happened because of the lack of personnel. But you have to keep those posts filled. It's also quality of life. If you go to work and you're expecting an 8-hour shift and you're there for 16 hours, and Tecumseh being a perfect example, most people don't live in Tecumseh that are corrections officers. They live in Lincoln, they live in Omaha, they live in the surrounding communities. Some of them, some of them travel 2 hours to get to work, hour and 45 minutes. They get there and they're told, you'll go home when you go home, basically. So they're there for 16 or an 18-hour shift, and then they go home, hour drive, let's say, back the next day. And it's happening more and more. We have corrections officers right now, and it's not the anomaly, it's pretty common, that are working better than 1,000 hours of overtime every year. That's another half year. And we have a couple that are working 2,000 hours of overtime. So if the standard for 40 hours a week for 52 weeks is 2,080 hours, that person is working double the post time, or two manpower positions. And the silly part about that is, if I could use that technical term, silly, the silly part of that is that we have this silo of money that hires people and takes care of their benefits, and then we have this silo of money that is overtime. And it doesn't dawn on anybody that with training and overtime, you could hire twice the number of people that you need and refill. The problem is quality of life pushes you out to go find someplace else to work. The dollars and cents do make a difference, someplace else to work. But not many of you, not many of us, not many human beings would stay someplace where they don't feel appreciated and they can't progress within their professional capability. It just doesn't work that way. So they have a new union, and I would listen to that new union about what their demands would be within reason. They need to find a structural, not a merit process, but a longevity process. As long as you're doing your job, then you step up to the next level. So the money would be there. We need to hire and keep people So there may have to be some rotations with shifts. If you're always at Tecumseh and you live in Omaha, it's an issue. So there might be other prison systems that you want to settle into. Years and years ago, I think that if the state of Nebraska had to do it all over again, they might have thought twice about putting a prison in Tecumseh away from the metropolitan area where that logistics issue was going to be bad. But we have what we have. So those 3 or 4 things, I think, are a good place to go. But I will also tell you, and those who know me know this, I try to be a consensus builder. And to do that, you have to have roundtable discussions group when you bring people in who've been there, done that, worn that T-shirt, to tell you what needs to be changed. And that would be probably the first thing, it will be the first thing I do, is bring those corrections officers in and say, where do we go from here? Because life needs to get better for you and for the state. I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much. Really?
Thank you very much for coming out. I have a question about Douglas County. Recently, we've seen a proposal for a new detention center, and at least in the initial stages, there's a lot of university people involved, and they're proposing to conduct evaluations faster, really get to the bottom of mental health issues. I've heard both sides of, I guess, the argument for it and the concerns with it. I wondered if you had any take on this new proposal.
Sure. First of all, this is something completely unrelated to what we're talking about here, but I have always had a real tough time with eminent domain. Really a tough time with eminent domain. And it comes from dealing with the pipeline issue and many other issues. There is a time and a place for that, and it's not very frequently that it should ever be used. I said one time that in a discussion just a couple months ago, and I think I was in O'Neill, and they were talking about eminent domain. I said it would take an act of God, and the woman said, well, that's never. I said, okay, whatever. I'm not going to argue about religion. But I think it should be extremely judiciously used, and that comes into that discussion. I don't believe that existing structure would afford the kind of campus that we need for juvenile justice. I'm not on any side or the other. I think that historic building, the edifice itself, is a beautiful building. But as all beautiful buildings are, it was built for a particular purpose, and it would take a major amount of reconstruction. What I think they're missing in this discussion is what's good for the kids. And if you're going to build a juvenile justice center that has green grass, has the kind of accommodations that you need to reduce recidivism, provide services, and not treat kids like criminals, because remember, we're detaining kids, we're not incarcerating kids, then I'm not sure that that's the right location for all of it. Now, I do know that we're tempered in that discussion with trying to find some place on the overflow of judges, which I helped create that problem by adding another judge down there, or two, in my time in the legislature. But that should be a separate issue. Courtrooms can be taken care of in a lot of places. I just don't think the kids are being, enough of the kid issue has been brought into that discussion. We're talking about developers and people who are going to make money, and there's a lot of that discussion going on that has nothing to do with the final outcome of what our metrics will be like treating a child in that institution. So I hope that kind of, if I said too much, I would either get Mike Yanni or Jim Kavanaugh to weigh in on it, and I don't want to do that. But they'll have their fight. We'll get to a point where they're doing what they need to do. I think it's good that they've slowed down and that they're looking at the process. But no eminent domain as far as I'm concerned.
Hi, so I actually had a question. I think you briefly touched on this, but what were some of the factors that you think have contributed to the population of Nebraska's prison system? I believe that you said that a lack of mental health services was one of these factors. What were the other ones?
So I think there's in the study that we did, LR 424, legislative study that you can pull up, you'll find a list of factors. I'll try to hit the highlights for you. Then we did LR 34 after that, and now this latest one, which is, I think, 24. But in that course of study, I've been involved with all of those special investigative committees and committees themselves. The first thing is the sentencing parameters. We tried to fix some of those and adjust some of those in a bill called, labeled LB 605. 605 was a bill that looked at the sentencing parameters in terms of how we sentence. Okay, if it's and I'll go back to just one that everybody probably hates and understands. How many times do you let somebody drink and drive before you throw them away, right? But when they do drink and drive, do you treat it or do you throw them away immediately? So how many times does that have to happen? We came back and said less times before they are actually incarcerated. However, we also said we enabled the judge from the bench to look at those preventative or those programs that could be ordered from the bench. They were restricted in terms of what they could do. We felt very strongly that it was a serious offense, but shouldn't jump to a felony conviction after X number of times. It should be treated in its infancy. So if the judge is able to send me to some kind of corrective action, no matter what I'm doing, then it's a good step in the right direction. That also came in 420, maybe it was the later study, but we came to a point where the subject matter courts, the specialty courts, came out of that discussion. You have a drug court that's able to look at prevention. You have a veterans court now in place that's able to look at vets in a different way. I've been there. I've been in combat. I understand. PTSD does things to your mind and the way that you think. We have a lot of Vietnam veterans that came back that were not welcomed back from their experience, and a lot of those issues weigh into how they reacted to society. So those veterans courts are very important. So 605 would have taken care of, would have changed some of the sentencing parameters. We had help from the Council of State Governments doing that. We had put it in place in terms of introduced the bill. Shortly thereafter, this new administration came in and said, you know what, you're not tough enough on crime. So we're going to have to go back and change some of those parameters if you're going to get it if you're going to introduce it. And if I'm going to sign it as the governor, Governor Ricketts said, these are things that have to be changed. So we negotiated and did what we could, but 605 was not as strong at the end as it was in the beginning in changing those sentencing parameters. Not my opinion. You can ask anyone who is on judiciary or involved with the issues. The next thing we tried to do is deal substantially with mental and behavioral health in the way that I just talked about, trying to find ways to treat up front, but also encouraging and funding those programs when a person is incarcerated. So things like anger management programs and things like actually seeing a doctor. We found with the Nico Jenkins thing, one of the study parameter, or one of the things we learned from our study, is that he had asked specifically for mental and behavioral health treatment. He asked to be committed. He told us if he gets out, he's going to kill people. And we let him out. He jammed out from solitary confinement to his community. So we said that can never happen again. How do we stop the jam outs? You have to be on parole or probation in order to get out. You have to have supervision so that we help you not recidivate and you have the services that you need. Just an aside from that, out of that, I introduced a bill that, and this seems small, but my bill basically said that if a person is Medicare or Medicaid qualified when they came in, get them requalified before they get out. Because if they don't have that psychotropic drug, if they don't have insulin, if they don't have the things that they need and they can't pay for those, their first resort is going to go back to their old way of life so that they can buy it and get it. I introduced that, shepherded it through, we got it passed, and I think it being in place has helped a small portion of people who are getting out continue to get the drugs they need to the day they get out of prison, which is an important step. We also tried to look at the programs that were in place that would draw down on the number of people that were in prison. We have, for example, something called a compassionate release program. It's in statute already. It says that if you're dying in prison, you can apply for a compassionate release and you can go to a care facility or a hospice facility and die. It doesn't make any difference what your offense was. You would appeal the process. It would go to the pardons board or for commutation, and you would be released into that facility. That did two things for us, or should do two things for us. It opens up bed space, and the other thing it does is we now can use Medicare, Medicaid, CMS dollars to treat the person when they're out, because we can't use those dollars when they're incarcerated. So that's a few of the things that would have been on our radar in terms of making sure we could reduce that population. I did introduce a bill actually 2 years ago that would have allowed a doctor or a loved one or someone who's a CMS who's in the system to advocate for a person for compassionate release, because right now the way the statute's written, it would have to be that individual. And if you're stage 4 Alzheimer's, I don't know that you know what's good for you at that point. So some of those things need to be changed in terms of changing what's happening. And probably the last thing, and probably one of the most important things, was increasing, because we've increased the services, so they're getting more anger management, they're getting more of the services they need to qualify for parole, increasing the number of people who we appoint to the parole board and multiple parole boards to see if we can't move the process along. We have people that have been waiting for parole, not eligible because they haven't had training, or eligible but they can't get a board hearing, and that backlog needs to be sped up a little bit. So that's additional parole people. It's also additional training and services to prepare people for their parole board. That's a few of them. Good to go? All right. Thanks.
I got a hot mic here.
Hello. Thanks for coming. So you've talked a little bit about prison overcrowding. I was wondering if you had any thoughts. Our jails also have a lot of people sitting around in them and a lot of people that are there because they simply can't afford to get out of jail. Mm-hmm. If you had any thoughts on what direction needs to be taken.
I think we all agree that if a person is living on the street and is charged with a crime and is taken and put into jail, and that person has to come up with a bond to get out of jail, it is almost going to be impossible for them to pay that bond and move forward. I think there are programs, there are several programs out there, some of them nonprofit, some of them sponsored by states, that would allow for a release in custody of, or something in lieu of, a cash bond system. And I think we have to start looking at those cash bond systems and how they're affecting our population base in our local jails and our county jails. Once again, those jails are also becoming depositories for those of us that are affected with mental, behavioral health, and substance abuse. And they're so overcrowded that those services that probably could be or should be provided either through community-based services, not necessarily from the state, but through community-based services, are not because of the availability of the services in the local communities. If you're lucky enough to get sick or arrested, either mentally, behavioral health, or substance abuse, if you're lucky enough to get sick or be affected or be arrested in some of our communities, there are more services available to you than others. And I won't draw a difference between whether it's a rural or an urban or a populated or a less populated areas, because I think it depends upon the leadership in that local community, whether or not you're going to lock somebody up and not let them out of jail. Sending them home in the custody of someone sometimes is an alternative. But I think we need to deal with that problem across the state, and it needs to be, again, not justice by geography or demographics. We have to look at a process to be put in place. The one thing that always happens, and it's the anomaly, and you know this by looking at the metrics, are quote-unquote illegal immigrant situation. When somebody gets in trouble and somebody causes a problem and they're in that status, then they're all bad, okay? And that's something we need to get away from as well. Everybody has a potential, you know, what my father used to say is, there but for the grace of God go I. Everybody has a potential to fall down the rabbit hole. How we get them out of there is kind of a service issue that the state and counties and local governments need to look at. But cash bonding being the part of that question, I think. Is there anything else that you'd like to hear about in that area? Yeah, I think we lost a really good person in Douglas County who was running our Douglas County Correctional Facilities. Dr. Foxhall was one of those that understood concepts and problems. But we all know we have financial constraints. Foxhall, right? He works for us now. Oh. All right, well, tell him I said hi. But don't tell him I complimented him because his head's already too big. Yeah, I think he had a handle on what was happening, and he certainly had some innovative ideas to try to provide those services, which is what we need in good leadership positions. So good for you guys for stealing him out. Sure.
So in the last legislative session, I can't remember what bill it was, but it was a bill passed where I think it was 3 counties in Nebraska, Douglas, Lancaster, and Sarpy, where juveniles would get counsel appointed regardless. And I just wondered if you could expand on why, you know, the other counties in Nebraska, obviously financially feasible, but I assume you were involved in that process.
Yeah. Several years ago, we had the bill that came before us. And that's when we put into place the jurisdictions that would, we told them you should have counsel for kids regardless. Douglas County, Sarpy County, it was actually the 2 counties who are their own judicial districts. So it's the second, I think, is Douglas County, and Sarpy is number 1, I think, how that works. And then there was one other one that actually we told them they had to do it. Yeah, it was a fight on the floor. It was a down and dirty fight on the floor that you know, people in western Nebraska, predominantly sparsely populated areas where, and I'm not paraphrasing, I'm quoting, we don't need you to tell us that kid needs a lawyer, he's got parents. Okay, and if you review that transcript, several senators said, we don't need you to tell us that kid needs a lawyer, he's got parents. Last I checked, most parents do not understand that if that child pleads guilty in a certain way, they won't be sitting here with a federally sponsored scholarship or grant program or loan. It makes them ineligible to do that. So I don't think that kids need to go into a courtroom. I know kids don't need to go into a courtroom without having proper counsel. I don't think I've taken this off for the last couple of years except to maybe clean it every once in a while. It's GALT at 50, G-A-U-L-T. Look it up. Google it, as I tell my millennial friends. GALT was a Supreme Court decision that basically said we're all entitled to legal counsel when we go into that courtroom. I'm hoping that if the state picks up the bill, that our folks in more rural Nebraska will understand that it is necessary to have our kids have counsel, to afford them the right to have counsel. There are judges that immediately from the bench say, you will have counsel. I'm hoping that more judges do that as well. We have this kind of precarious, this is kind of the same church, different pew, but we have this precarious position around the state where we have some juvenile courts in some areas and not in other areas. So the regular judge is taking care of the kids. And most of them, Through the Eyes of the Child, which was the Chief Justice's program, that's another one that you should look up, and it was a wonderful program. But they spend more time with regular judges talking about juvenile issues and, potentially how to find diversion programs or rule in those cases differently because of different circumstances. And some of it has to do with the age of the brain and all those kind of things that we all know are different. So yeah, thanks for the question. And it'll come up again. Senator Patty Pansing Brooks is the one who gave these all away, and she's very passionate about making sure our kids are all have the right kind of legal counsel, and I'm with her 100%. Did that answer your question? And more? Anything else? Well, 10 minutes left. Do we have to hold them until? No, not a regular class. Okay, let me just kind of finish up then if there are any other questions. I really appreciate the time that you've given me and the attention you've given me and the good questions. I have some cards that are available for you. I think it's important that public officials and your elected representatives are accessible to you. That's why I've always included my mobile number on the back of one of my cards when I was in session as Senator Krist and now campaigning. And believe it or not, in 10 years, I've only had to block about 200 calls. It's not bad. But those, it's paid, for me, it paid great dividends because I get to listen to people when they have a conversation that is important to them. And then I would also tell you that within the criminal justice system, whether it's the juvenile or the adult system, that your legislature has an office in place. It doesn't have to just be justice related. It's everything related. It's called the Ombudsman's Office. And if you don't understand that one, I would also Google that. The Ombudsman's Office in most states is that depository of information that can help the citizens get to a point where they get their questions answered one by one, individually, if you will. And that is part, in my mind, the legislature makes laws and then appropriates the money, and then it also has an oversight capability. And that oversight capability is where that Ombudsman's Office is so genuinely needed and used so that when there are issues, there are answers to those questions. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it.